Hola, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por venir a Cine Tonalá. Estamos celebrando nuestro 10º aniversario. En esta semana hemos programado 6 películas de Labruce. Esta es la Masterclass en la que él va a poder abarcar gran parte como de los temas con los que trabaja. Quiero agradecer a los patrocinadores, al Grupo Hábitat, a Mezcal Ojo de Tigre. Cuando salgan de la proyección, de la Masterclass, podrán tomar un cóctel. También a Salón Silicón, que Lau Salazar nos va a ayudar presentando a Bruce en esta colaboración que estamos haciendo. Y bueno, Laos, un aplauso primero para Laos, por favor.
Gracias. Bueno, primero quiero agradecer a Juan por invitarnos a Salón Silicón como proyecto y a mí como presentador. Esto lo digo en español para que me puedan entender, pero ya a partir de ahora voy a hablar en inglés para hablar sobre la persona que venimos a ver todos aquí, ¿no? Que es Bruce Labruce. Okay, so I made a little speech before beginning because I think it's important to get to know a little thing. Okay. So I'm gonna talk about my personal experience, okay? Oh, I think it's good. I'm a little bit nervous now because I was like, yeah, no, I'm not nervous outside. I was like, yeah, it's fine, whatever. And now that I can see your faces here, it's like, oh my god, a lot of people. So I'm gonna imagine that most of you are naked.
That doesn't work.
No, but it's, I mean, there's a lot of people who I will like to imagine naked. Okay. Okay, so here I go. The first time I heard the name Bruce Labruce was in a Mexican skate magazine named Gorilla. I don't know if any of you remember. When I was a teenager. I was 15 years old, and there was this short review of the Raspberry Reich. The image of a very sexy boy with a huge gun and a wallpaper of Che Guevara resonated strongly in my head, along with the idea of gay pornography with homo-terrorist revolutionaries. A couple of years passed until I had my first encounter with a Bruce Labruce film, thanks to my dealer of art films and auteur cinema, a man who probably knew before I did that I was a little homosexual on the verge of blossoming. He recommended me to see No Skin Off My Ass, a movie about skinheads and punks in his own words, and I was really obsessed in that moment with skinheads and punks. So, after seeing the movie, my mind was altered. I illegally, started downloading everything I could.
Pay me later.
Vamos. I started downloading everything I could from this director. This director I had newly discovered. So I watched Otto, or Up with the People, Hustler White, my favorite, Skin Flick, and The Raspberry Reich. Now the years have passed and the world has changed also. So I want to ponder the importance of these films in my life and probably in the lives of other faggots who, like me, did not fit in the narrative of the good homosexual. The one who was well-dressed in designer clothes, a fan of pop music, a domesticated gay man whose life was acceptable to the heterosexual masses he wanted to belong to. For all of us who somehow were part of countercultural movements and the LGBTQI+ collective, movies like these were a breath of fresh air. Those of us who wanted something else that wasn't under the rainbow found our desires reflected in films, poems, and music that define gayness. Labruce calls into question the values not only of the heteropatriarchal society, but also of the gay community that has been assimilated into those as well. His filmography is a constant reminder that homosexuality is revolutionary, uncomfortable, and subversive. More than 20 years ago, Bruce Labruce understood that there is no better tool than cinema to disrupt moral discourses. Wickedly play with the taboos of hypocritical society and highlight pleasure and its political implications, because desire, and especially the desire of queer people, is political. Now, more than ever, with the rise of the far right in the world, we need to revisit Bruce Labruce cinema to twist the new morality and normality that is imposed on us. We need to embrace our desires, our lust, as a form of resistance against the oppression that follow and those who come. We need to light fires in the minds of faggots, dykes, and trans people, especially the younger generations, to invite them to join the homosexual intifada. Thank you.
Yay.
And Bruce Labruce.
Thank you, Les. That was beautiful. I guess I'm going to get up on the chair, so I hope I don't trip. Okay. Yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks to everyone here at Tonalá for a great week. Amazing, Juan Pablo, Ernesto, everyone else. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great. I just actually came from a full retrospective at the Quebecois Cinematheque in Montreal, which was really, they showed practically almost every film I've made, and it was really interesting to go back and re-examine my own work, and maybe a bit too much. You know, sometimes when they start throwing retrospectives at you, you don't know whether they're trying to celebrate you or bury you. You know, so. But for me, it kind of is invigorating me and making me think about the films that I still haven't made, that I want to make, and that I hopefully will continue to make. So I try to take inspiration, even though sometimes it's very painful to watch your old work. I mean, I try not to do it too much, and sometimes you're forced to, but you know, that's part of the whole process, is looking at where you were at a particular time, the mistakes you made. Sometimes you cringe and say, "Oh, fuck! I wish I could have done that differently," or the circumstances that around the making of the films that were so like insane, which I'll get into during this talk. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give, because a lot of people are interested in my work, partly because of its my use of pornography and what I consider my political use of pornography. I'm going to show various clips from my movies, from when I started making films in the late 80s up until the present, and just to illustrate what I'm talking about. So I'll talk a bit and then show a clip and then talk some more. So I started out as a queer punk in Toronto in the 80s. But I went to film school. I went to university, York University in Toronto, and I had an amazing film professor who was my main mentor. His name was Robin Wood. He was the favorite critic of like Scorsese and Godard or Truffaut and people like that. When he wrote books about Hitchcock and Claude Chabrol and Arthur Penn and Howard Hawks and he wrote for Cahiers de Cinema, even though he was like a history teacher or an English teacher, a high school teacher, and he became internationally celebrated. He moved to Toronto. He was teaching film there, and he had come out just. He was married and had 3 kids, and he came out as gay when he was much later in life, during the gay liberation movement, and wrote a very influential article called "The Responsibilities of a Gay Film Critic," and which had a big impact on me because he told very personal anecdotes about his life in this article, but he also talked about mainstream cinema and the homosexual subtext in mainstream cinema, particularly in Howard Hawks. So I took 3 courses with him in university, including a Japanese cinema course, and he was my thesis supervisor. I did a thesis on, my thesis was a shot-by-shot analysis of Hitchcock's Vertigo. And at that time there was no VHS practically or anything, so I had this projector that they just invented where you could like stop the film in the projector and have a frame projected without burning the film, and that's how I kind of examined the film. That's one thing I'll also get into, just talking about my work, is that I really bridged that gap between starting making my first work on film I had the experience of working on this, working on a steam back with, bins full of film clips, way, before digital editing was invented, and then my career career as they call it, career, kind of like, traversed that whole transition to digital, which was very painful in a lot of ways, not only because it was a whole new technology that had to be learned, but also aesthetically, I really struggled with the digital aesthetic. I took a photography course. I was a film studies major, but I took a production course. Two. The first one was still photography, and I'm still a photographer today as well. I have published some photography books. And then second year was Super 8. So I did study that in school, but I just had, I didn't think I could ever be a filmmaker. I thought it was too technically, I was like a technophobic sissy, like I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to figure out how to work in this in movies, which seems kind of like macho, or did at the time, and just it was so expensive. I mean, I come from I grew up on a farm. I come from a working class background, and I had to put myself through university and waiting tables and with washing dishes. So if there's any aspiring filmmakers here who are doing that, believe me, I did that. I waited tables and was a bartender till I was like 32 years old, while I was making my films. Or trying to make them, and using my own money to finance them when I couldn't find it anywhere else. So it's a long process. I mean, it's a long struggle to be a filmmaker, and so maybe you'll get a little bit of inspiration from what I managed to do. I was studying at university, but meanwhile I discovered the punk scene downtown. I was hanging out with this all-girl punk band called Fifth Column, and I ended up living with them in a squat for a couple of years, which was a real education. I was the only guy, and with a bunch of like hardcore punk feminist, rockers, and everyone I knew was working in Super 8 at that time. A lot of people in the alternative art scene as well in Toronto. And GB Jones and I also started a fanzine called JD's, which stands for Juvenile Delinquents. It was a punk fanzine, queer, and we kind of coined the term queer core, the queer core movement, which is a gay punk movement and a gay and lesbian punk movement. And we did these fanzines, so we had to learn how to do our own. It was do-it-yourself, like, again, pre-internet, pre-social media. So we did it all, the layout, the cutting and pasting, the collages. We wrote manifestos. We wrote fiction. We wrote comic books. We took photographs of each other doing crazy things. Like whenever someone would do something crazy, like pierce their own nipple with a safety pin, we'd be like, there with our cameras, like taking pictures in movies, and so it was partly. I just started out kind of documenting our lives as queer punks living in downtown Toronto. We were kind of alienated from the mainstream gay world even at that time in the 80s. In the mid 80s, we thought it was like this very white bourgeois middle class movement, and we encountered a lot of like sexism and misogyny and racism, and it was even starting to get kind of assimilated and way back then. And of course, it was the AIDS era and the beginning of the AIDS era, and we really rejected the gay movement both politically, because we thought it was bourgeois and uninteresting, and also kind of aesthetically we weren't very into it, except for like we did like kind of certain old school kind of gay films, like The Boys in the Band and whatnot. But so we turned to punk, and then when we became punks, we started making our fanzines and movies, and we found out that it was basically the punk scene, which was supposed to be more subversive and radical, had the same problems as the gay scene. There was racism, there was misogyny, and with the added bonus of homophobia on top of it. So I would, which made us very kind of politicized us in a weird way, because or for me at least, it made me realize that, that sometimes, and you see if you watch a lot of my films, I quite often critique the radical left as much as I critique the right and the conservatives. Partly was I became disillusioned with academia and kind of didn't pursue it because I ran into a lot of professors at university who were like espousing like Marxist doctrine and like, radical kind of anti-family, anti-kind of patriarchy kind of like theory, but they weren't living it in practice. They were actually married and had big houses, and so that was my first taste of people who kind of don't really practice what they preach, or are kind of like who hide behind, who kind of have a certain hypocrisy about not putting into practice the theory that they're teaching. So, which is a theme that runs through all my work as well. And another theme that runs through all my work is the oppressed becoming the oppressor, which is something that I find with the gay movement. I know in Toronto there was an incident, a phenomenon happened where a lot of gay men bought a lot of property in downtown Toronto in the gay neighborhood, and at a certain point they formed like a vigilante group because there was transsexual prostitutes and drug dealers like in this area, and they formed a vigilante group and went around with flashlights like pointing at the sex trade workers, and it was like they themselves had kind of turned into the police, where 10 years earlier they were the ones that were fucking in these alleys and doing drugs, and now they were like, became the police. So it's always very instructive to make sure, for me, to critique the left as much as the right, and several of my films, The Raspberry Right, The Misandrous, are kind of very pointed critiques of the radical left as well. Okay, so I'm going to show the first clip, which is, I'm going to show you a few of my first very early Super 8 experimental movies before I made my first feature, and we'll start with this one. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so that movie just basically explains my entire career, and I don't have to say anything else. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing since I've been rewatching my movies that so many themes that crop up in all my work, like to this day, including my last two features, are the same kind of themes that reiterated over and over again. And when you're a creator and when you write your own, I've written all my own films, and you find that in a way it seems like you're making the same movie over and over, or you're just making one big movie. But there's a lot going on there. So the redheaded woman is G.B. Jones, who I started the queercore movement with, and she made her own Super 8 work as well, and transgender, and she and I appeared in each other's movies, and kind of like you can see me there already taking my clothes off. I was kind of stripping, which I hadn't gotten into porn yet, but that was kind of in my early experimental films. I was like constantly stripping and taking my clothes off, so it was leading to something. The binoculars, I quite often have female characters who are in my movies who are filmmakers, and they're kind of a certain kind of point of identification for me in the films. Sort of creating a kind of distance in terms of like the gaze and filtering the movie through the kind of point of view of the female characters who often have binoculars or cameras. It's kind of a way of, I have a lot of distanciation techniques in my film, particularly when I'm doing porn. But I mean, so the aesthetic was very much like the fanzines. It was like collage. It was like this was pre-internet, so I just like shot that footage of Mary Tyler Moore in a movie called "What's So Bad About Being Good." What's so bad about feeling good? I just shot it right off the TV with a Super 8 camera, and then spliced it together with the footage that I shot of G.B. Jones. And that kind of aesthetic kind of runs through all my early work. Instead of using found footage, whatever you could find, as I was saying, we were in the punk scene, and the punks were very homophobic. So when I would show or some of them, and the skinheads, some of them were totally cool and not homophobic at all, but I would show my films at punk clubs and get punched in the nose, and my girlfriends would like have to form a circle around me and protect me because I was a sissy. And so that's one of the reasons why we started taking found porn footage that I would find like in a bin, like in a used bookstore or something. You used to be able to find Super 8 porn films, gay porn films, and I would splice that into some of my early work as well. So that was my first, and in JD's, our fanzine, that we would use a lot of found pornographic images, whatever. If there was any like punks in like porn magazines, we'd cut it out and paste it into our fanzine. And so we kind of started making our very radical, or very kind of naive kind of porn very early on. We were also influenced by the Situationists, so this idea of détournement and like taking G.B. Jones did or my friend Candy, who was also involved, did a comic book of Archie, like the Archie comics, and cut and paste it to make it seem like Archie and Jughead were having a homosexual relationship. So that's classic. Détournement, Situationist détournement, and also G.B. Jones did these drawings called Tom Girls, which were a lesbian version of Tom of Finland. So she'd take the Tom of Finland drawings and change them to lesbian. So that was the kind of tomfoolery we were up to. Let's run. This is probably one of my first Super 8 films. So that guy's actually very famous. His name is Dave Dichter, of a band called punk band called Millions of Dead Cops, MDC, and he was coming through town. We lived in these kind of squat-like apartments, and bands would come through town and would stay with us, and sometimes after a night of the band playing and drinking and whatnot, we get out our cameras at the end of the night, and that was our first foray into actually shooting our own kind of pornography. That was Candy's dog Spike in the cameo there, and these films were just made for very underground audiences. Like I said, it was pre-internet. They were just made in alternative art spaces and punk clubs, and they were meant for a very limited kind of audience. But this idea of using porn for political purposes, and particularly in homophobic contexts, to really be unapologetic about queer sex, explicit queer sex, was kind of one of our main political strategies. So let's roll the next clip. It's another one of my early Super 8 films called I Know What It's Like to Be Dead. So this is 1988, and you can see that I was, again, like stripping, starting to get into this idea of being intrigued by making pornographic work, but I was totally shy, and that's as far as I would go. You can tell that I was a ginger, of course, but that was kind of, but in the fanzine, the JD's fanzine, where, like I said, we were using more like hardcore imagery. I was writing short stories, one of which, a series of short stories that got made into a movie actually that you can find called Sugar, that I didn't direct, but a friend of mine directed, and which is based on my relationship with a hustler. So this period also is when I became interested in hustlers and skinheads, and you know, these kinds of subcultures that I found very sexually stimulating. I had a boyfriend who was a hustler. He was my first real boyfriend around this time, and he was gay for pay, like he was straight, but we were kind of like, he had a girlfriend, but we were boyfriends, and behind her back, and he really started my fixation on, kick-started my fixation on hustlers. And I mean, it's kind of a long, involved story, and I'm going to have to really move things along here because it's a long, I'm not going to be able to show everything, but I want to give you the groundwork of where everything came from. He then, we broke up after like 8 or 9 months, and I lost track of him, and I ran into him in Toronto on the street like over 2 years later, and he had turned into a neo-Nazi skinhead. And there was tons of them in Toronto at that time. At a certain point, it was interesting in the early 90s, they just all disappeared. The punks kind of ran them out of town, literally. But because they'd all been hanging out at the same venues, because they listened to the same music at that time, this kind of hardcore thrash music. And so for me, as a sissy punk, it was like very the mosh pit, the sweaty like punks and skinheads with their shirts off. It was so like obviously homoerotic, and but they were so homophobic at the same time that it really like turned something in my brain, and it made me that became a real kind of strong fetish for me. And another theme that runs through all my work, or a lot of my work, is the relationship between homosexuality and fascism, which goes back to the beyond, but obviously the Third Reich and the secret police, and Mishima, and you can trace it through the history of the 20th century. So and so many right-wing leaders in Europe who are now like who are extreme right-wing leaders like Pim Fortuyn, etc. were gay or revealed to be gay. So that's a theme that always intrigues me. I invited him into my house because he was homeless, and I couldn't believe he was serious about being a neo-Nazi, so I was trying to humiliate him out of it and joke him out of it. And then one day after like a couple months, he beat the crap out of me like in front of my apartment, and so I never saw him again after that. But the damage was already done. It kind of turned me on, So, let's go. So then I made Jürgen Berning is my producer. Has produced all my early films right up until the last one was The Misandrists, which is a lesbian, separatist, terrorist, feminist, softcore porn film, and. So he was working in Buffalo at an art gallery called Buffalo, New York, called Hallwell's, as the visiting film and video curator, and he scouted work in Toronto, and he saw my early films, and I asked him if he would give me money to make my first feature, and so that became No Skin Off My Ass. So let's sort of look at that. So you can kind of see the progression. I was threatening to take off my clothes in the early movies, and finally made a kind of porn movie. But it was a very naive kind of porn, and something that we were totally naive about how porn is made, and kind of about the implications of like putting yourself on screen, having explicit sex. It was, again, pre-internet. There was no OnlyFans. Nobody was really making films, and kind of, or it was rare for people to put themselves in films having sex. this film is about I play a hairdresser, a gay hairdresser who becomes obsessed with a skinhead and loses has an existential crisis. And that was my boyfriend at the time. So Klaus von Booker, he was in two of my films, this one and the next one, Super 8.5. And so I got him to, he shaved his head and we styled him as a skinhead, and that was our first sort of attempt at making a kind of a porn film. But I had no connection with the porn world or didn't know any porn actors or anything like that. Porn wasn't as mainstream as it is now either. So, I never intended this movie. I began showing it on Super 8 with the soundtrack on cassette in clubs and underground clubs and punk clubs, and I turned the projector on and played the cassette tape at the same time. And then Jürgen gave me money to blow it up to 16 millimeter, and which he did, and then it got on the film festival circuit. The gay and lesbian film festival circuit was kind of exploding in the late 80s, early 90s, and so it started playing internationally, and then it kind of got leapt to the international non-gay circuit as well, to some screenings, and so suddenly this very private movie with this very sexual kind of scenes in it, explicit scenes, was being screened internationally, which kind of wreaked havoc with my relationship with my boyfriend and my other friends, and it was kind of a bit messy. And so I made my second feature length film, Super 8.5. I shot in 16 millimeter, and it was basically about the experience of having become known as a kind of international underground pornographer with my first film. The other thing that was happening at that time was the cops. When I did the blow up to 16 millimeter, the lab called the cops in Toronto. This would be in like the early 90s, and the cops wanted to confiscate the negative, or they wanted me to cut out 3 scenes from the negative: sex with violence, bondage, bondage and discipline, and toe sucking, basically. So it's a long story, but I got it back, the negative back without having to cut it, and went to another lab. And but also I was a photographer and starting to take naked and kind of pornographic photos, and the photo lab would call the cops on me as well. So it was kind of a strange time. Okay, so let's run the clip from Super 8.5, which is kind of a movie. I call it a cautionary biopic. It's a faux documentary about a washed-up porn star who gets rediscovered by an underground filmmaker who's actually kind of exploiting. But I do actually get fucked in this movie at the ass, so that's one for the books. So this was this is super low budget filmmaking. The first film, Let's Get Off Mass, was totally non-sync sound, and just like I kind of did a soundtrack that doesn't even try to be synced. This was the first time I actually shot 16 millimeter sync sound. Still super low budget. No Skin Off Mask cost like $15,000, including the blow up. This one cost like maybe $30,000 at the time, which is in the 90s, So super no budget filmmaking. I was, like I said, I was waiting tables and bartending. It took me 2 years to make the film, and the cops were after me and for making porn, and I was it's a long story. My DP had a nervous breakdown and all this stuff. I broke up with my boyfriend who was in the film during the making of it, and it was really messy, and I had a falling out with G.B. Jones, who I did the fanzine with, and I kind of like lost the plot, and it was, but the one thing, and it's my main, I have 2 kind of main rules of filmmaking. One is, if you're a filmmaker, make films. Because a lot of people want to make films or try to make films, but I mean, you have to make films. And And the other thing is finish your film. That's my second rule. Finish your film. Because I know many people who, tried to make films and had actually a good friend of mine, Kenny, had an amazing footage. She did a lesbian remake of Boys in the Band on Super 8, and the footage is absolutely phenomenal, but she never finished the film. So it kind of, I know quite a few people. So who in that boat, So I knew I had to finish this film, or I would never become a filmmaker. And it took me 2 years, and so many disasters happened, and I couldn't afford to. The sound is a mess. I couldn't afford to hire a proper sound person, and it's a kind of shambles film. The guy that did this was made on film, so you had to cement the. You make the negative. You kind of cement it together, and the cuts were all falling apart when they were trying to make the first answer print of the film, and it was falling apart in the projector. And so, and when I finally did show it at a porn theater in Toronto, it was the first reel was still out of sync when I showed it, and but I finished it, and that's the most important thing. And so that gave me enough kind of motivation to go on to the next one, which was, there was so much shit going on in Toronto with all the cops and my ex-boyfriend and my ex-friend and drama and gay drama and So I moved to LA. I went to LA to make my next film, which is Hustler White. It took me, I moved down there for a year and made this film in collaboration with a fetish photographer named Rick Castro. So let's show that clip. So this is a 16 millimeter color film. It was the first time I worked with James Carman, who's shot about 7 of my films. Jürgen Berding introduced me to him. We shot it in 12 days. For $50,000 American dollars, including post. So there was nothing. We had our shooting ratio was 1-to-1 practically. We had no time for hardly ever did we have a second or third take. I'm really trying to move this along because I want to get to the later stuff as well, but and to trace my sort of how I got into making mainstream pornography as well. So you can see it's still pornographic. The fetishes are still there. A lot of my work, practically all of my work, is based on some kind of fetish. Gerontophilia, which I'll show a brief clip of, is about about an 18-year-old boy who has a fetish for the elderly, sexual fetish, romantic fetish. My latest Centercease is about twincest, about sort of the fetish for the narcissistic fetish of twins having sex with each other. But the point is, I try to make it kind of more to show the humanity of it, for lack of a better word, to make it romantic. I find that people who have fetishes are quite often very romantic. They have a real devotion to their love object, whatever it might be, a kind of worship. It's very spiritual. It can be very spiritual. So, and most people look down on it and think they can pervert it, but I find it fascinating, and kind of I envy people who have that kind of strong devotion to something. And that's another theme that kind of has emerged around this time, that runs through all my work, which is the intersection of religious and sexual ecstasy. So it was a crazy movie. Some people who worked, it was a really small group of people, dedicated people, a small crew, total guerrilla filmmaking, no permits, which characterizes most of my early work. Constantly being caught, chased by the cops, and it's not really I don't really enjoy it that much. Like some people maybe get off on that. For me, it was very difficult. It was I had to force myself into these positions and situations, and kind of shooting was always, up until recently for me, shooting was always extremely traumatic, you know, and partly because of the circumstances, and of course there's no money, so I edited it with my this great woman writer, Cypher, and we had no money. We were like starving practically in the editing room. We'd get really giddy and like laugh. It was like we were editing on a very, very early digital. Even though we shot a film, we edited on a very early digital system, D-Vision it was called, and if it crashed, like sometimes we'd lose like 2 days worth of editing. There was no way of backing it up, and it was crazy. But on the basis of a rough cut, we got accepted to Sundance, which was like amazing. And Strand Releasing, who released a lot of my films in the States from LA, had released my first 2 films, and so they helped get it into Sundance. We had the world premiere in '95 or something, and during that scene I just showed with the stump fucking, literally a third of the audience walked out of the screening en masse together. So that was a bit traumatic too, but kind of like not too savvy. Okay, so after this, I was spending a lot of time in New York. I became a porn photographer. I was working for magazines like Honcho and Inches, taking photography of like naked guys with hard-ons. In fact, Tony Ward, who started Hustler White, started out that way. He became, he was Madonna's boyfriend. He became the muse of photographers like Herb Ritz and Greg Gorman, but he started out posing for like porn magazines. So he was really perfect for the role. The film got a lot of attention because he had just broken up with Madonna, and it was very scandalous, or they had broken up with each other. And so then I have tried in my career to make larger budgeted films. Like back in the 90s, I had a script that was set in the porn world that wasn't a porn film, but it was set in the porn world, that I had attached to a producer. In fact, the producer, his name is Philippe Aubert, who just produced like Triangle of Sadness. He's a good friend of mine, and he said that I had the distinction of being the only filmmaker that he had failed at raising the money to make the film. So Jürgen and I had gained reputations as pornographers, even though we thought with these first 3 films that we were just making like sexually explicit art films, and because I couldn't get a bigger budgeted film made, Jürgen started the first ever porn company in Berlin called Katzo Film, and my next 3 films were financed by his porn company. And the stipulation sort of was, if I would make a hardcore version for the porn company and a softcore version that I could release more like on the film festival circuit and even theatrical release, still pretty much pre-internet, but now moving into digital. So I made my first digital film, which after Hustler White, I think, which is The Raspberry Rack. So it's which is shot in Berlin. After LA, I started spending all my time in Berlin, and I shot about 7 films in Berlin, and I've done 3 or 4 theater productions there as well. So again, sorry for the quality of the clips, are pretty low res, but this film also cost probably 80,000 euros or something at the time. I was really this is one of the moments I almost sort of gave up filmmaking. We had no money. I didn't think the film I could do it. It was very difficult. So the night before we were supposed to start shooting in Berlin, I called my producer at like 4 in the morning, and I was going to call off the movie. And I said, this is not happening. It wasn't organized. I'd never met the actress before, Susanna, until the second day on set. I didn't know if I could make it work. It was like crazy. And so I called him, and he went to his answering machine, and he didn't answer. So I went to bed and got up in the morning and went to work and made the film. So just to tell you, if you're aspiring filmmakers, whatever, sometimes you just have to plow through, like, even if it seems like it's absolutely not working or